The History of Rome, Volumes 1 to 5, by Theodor Mommsen. Translated by William Purdie Dickinson. Dedications, Prefaces, and Introductions. The History of Rome by Theodor Mommsen. Translated with the sanction of the author by William Purdie Dickinson, D.D., LL.D., Professor of Divinity in the University of Glasgow. Dedications. The first volume of the original bears this inscription: To my friend Moritz Haupt of Berlin. The second, to my dear associates Ferdinand Hitzig of Zurich and Karl Ludwig of Vienna, 1852, 1853, 1854. And the third, dedicated with old and loyal affection to Otto Jahn of Bonn. Preface by the translator. When the first portion of this translation appeared in 1861, it was accompanied by a preface, for which I was indebted to the kindness of the late Dr. Schmitz, introducing to the English reader the work of an author whose name and merits, though already known to scholars, were far less widely familiar than they are now. After 35 years, such an introduction is no longer needed, but nonetheless gratefully do I recall how much the book owed at the outset to Dr. Schmidt's friendly offices. The following extracts from my own prefatory note, dated December 1861, state the circumstances under which I undertook the translation, and give some explanation as to its methods and aims. In requesting English scholars to receive with indulgence the first portion of a translation of Dr. Mommsen's Römische Geschichte, I am somewhat in the position of Albinus, who, when appealing to his readers to pardon the imperfections of the Roman history which he had written in indifferent Greek, was met by Cato with the rejoinder that he was not compelled to write at all, that if the Amphictyonic Council had laid their commands on him, the case would have been different, but that it was quite out of place to ask the indulgence of his readers when his task had been self-imposed. I may state, however, that I did not undertake this task until I had sought to ascertain whether it was likely to be taken up by anyone more qualified to do justice to it. When Dr. Mommsen's work accidentally came into my hands some years after its first appearance, and revived my interest in studies which I had long laid aside for others more strictly professional, I had little doubt that its merits would have already attracted sufficient attention amidst the learned leisure of Oxford, to induce some of her great scholars to clothe it in an English dress. But it appeared on inquiry that, while there was a great desire to see it translated, and the purpose of translating it had been entertained in more quarters than one, the projects had from various causes miscarried. Mr. George Robinson published an excellent translation, to which, so far as it goes, I desire to acknowledge my obligations, of the introductory chapters on the early inhabitants of Italy. But other studies and engagements did not permit him to proceed with it. I accordingly requested and obtained Dr. Mommsen's permission to translate his work. The translation has been prepared from the third edition of the original, published in the spring of the present year at Berlin. The sheets have been transmitted to Dr. Mommsen, who has kindly communicated to me such suggestions as occurred to him. I have thus been enabled, more especially in the first volume, to correct those passages where I had misapprehended or failed to express the author's meaning, and to incorporate in the English work various additions and corrections which do not appear in the original. In executing the translation, I have endeavored to follow the original as closely as is consistent with a due regard to the difference of idiom. Many of our translations from the German are so literal as to reproduce the very order of the German sentence, so that they are, if not altogether unintelligible to the English reader, at least far from readable, while others deviate so entirely from the form of the original as to be no longer translations in the proper sense of the term. I have sought to pursue a middle course between a mere literal translation, which would be repulsive, and a loose paraphrase, which would be, in the case of such a work, peculiarly unsatisfactory. Those who are most conversant with the difficulties of such a task will probably be the most willing to show forbearance towards the shortcomings of my performance, and in particular towards the too numerous traces of the German idiom, which, on glancing over the sheets, I find it still to retain. The reader may perhaps be startled by the occurrence now and then of modes of expression more familiar and colloquial than is usually the case in historic works. This, however, is a characteristic feature of the original, to which, in fact, it owes not a little of its charm. Dr. Mommsen often uses expressions that are not to be found in the dictionary, and he freely takes advantage of the unlimited facilities afforded by the German language for the coinage or the combination of words. I have not unfrequently, in deference to his wishes, used such combinations as Carthagino-Sicilian, Romano-Hellenic, although less congenial to our English idiom, for the sake of avoiding longer paraphrases. In Dr. Mommsen's book, as in every other German work that has occasion to touch on abstract matters, there occur sentences couched in a peculiar terminology and not very susceptible to translation. There are one or two sentences of this sort, more especially in the chapter on religion in the first volume, and in the critique of Euripides, as to which I am not very confident that I have seized or succeeded in expressing the meaning. In these cases, I have translated literally. In the spelling of proper names, I have generally adopted the Latin orthography as more familiar to scholars in this country, except in cases where the spelling adopted by Dr. Mommsen is marked by any special peculiarity. At the same time, entire uniformity in this respect has not been aimed at. I have ventured in various instances to break up the paragraphs of the original and to furnish them with additional marginal headings, and have carried out more fully the notation of the years BC on the margin. It is due to Dr. Schmitz, who has kindly encouraged me in this undertaking, that I should state that I alone am responsible for the execution of the translation. Whatever may be thought of it in other respects, I venture to hope that it may convey to the English reader a tolerably accurate impression of the contents and general spirit of the book. In a new library edition which appeared in 1868, I incorporated all the additions and alterations which were introduced in the fourth edition of the German, some of which were of considerable importance, and I took the opportunity of revising the translation so as to make the rendering more accurate and consistent. Since that time, no change has been made, except the issue in 1875 of an index. But as Dr. Mommsen was good enough some time ago to send me a copy in which he had taken the trouble to mark the alterations introduced in the more recent editions of the original, I thought it due to him, and to the favor with which the translation had been received, that I should subject it to a fresh revision, as should bring it into conformity with the last form, 8th edition, of the German, on which, as I learned from him, he hardly contemplates further change. As compared with the first English edition, the more considerable alterations of addition, omission, or substitution amount, I should think, to well nigh 100 pages. I have corrected various errors in renderings, names, and dates, though not without some misgiving that others may have escaped notice or been incurred afresh, and I have still further broken up the text into paragraphs and added marginal headings. The index, which was not issued for the German book till 9 years after the English translation was published, has now been greatly enlarged from its more recent German form, and has been, at the expenditure of no small labor, adapted to the altered paging of the English. I have also prepared as an accompaniment to it a collation of pagings, which will materially facilitate the finding of references made to the original or to the previous English editions. I have had much reason to be gratified by the favor with which my translation has been received on the part alike of Dr. Mommsen himself and of the numerous English scholars who have made it the basis of the references to his work. Footnote 1. It has, I believe, been largely in use at Oxford for the last 30 years, but it has not apparently had the good fortune to have come to the knowledge of the writer of an article on Roman history published in the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1886, which at least makes no mention of its existence, or yet of Mr. Baring Gould, who in his Tragedy of the Caesars, Volume 1, page 1040, has presented Dr. Mommsen's well-known character of Caesar in an independent version. His rendering is often more spirited than accurate. While in several cases important words, clauses, or even sentences are omitted, in others the meaning is loosely or imperfectly conveyed, e.g. in Hellenistic for Hellenic, success for plentitude of power, attempts or operations for achievements, prompt to recover for ready to strike, swashbuckler for brilliant, many for unyielding, accessible to all for complacent towards every one, smallest fiber for inmost core, ideas for ideals, unsustained with blood for as bloodless as possible, described for apprehended, purity for clearness, smug for plain or homely, avoid for avert, taking his dark course for stealing towards his aim by paths of darkness, rose for transformed himself, checked everything like a praetorian domination, for allowed no hierarchy of marshals or governments or praetorians to come into existence, and in one case the meaning is exactly reversed, when never sought to soothe where he could not cure intractable evils, stands for never disdained, at least to mitigate by palliatives evils that were incurable. Back to the preface. I trust that in the altered form and new dress for which the book is indebted to the printers, it may still further meet the convenience of the reader. September 1894. Introductory note by Dr. Mommsen. The Varronian computation by years of the city is retained in the text. The figures on the margin indicate the corresponding year before the birth of Christ. In calculating the corresponding years, the year 1 of the city has been assumed as identical with the year 753 BC and with a limp 6-4. Although, if we take into account the circumstance that the Roman solar year began with the first day of March, and the Greek with the first day of July, the year 1 of the city would, according to more exact calculation, correspond to the last 10 months of 753, and the first 2 months of 752 BC, and to the last 4 months of OL 6-3, and the first 8 of OL 6-4. The Roman and Greek money has uniformly been commuted on the basis of assuming the libral and the sestertius, and the denarius and the Attic drachma, respectively as equal, and taking for all sums above 100 denarii the present value in gold, and for all sums under 100 denarii the present value in silver of the corresponding weight. The Roman pound, equal to 327.45 grams of gold, equal to 4,000 sesterces, has thus, according to the ratio of gold to silver, 1 to 15.5, been reckoned at 304.5 Prussian thalers, about 43 pounds sterling, and the denarius, according to the value of silver, at 7 Prussian Groschen, about 8d. Footnote to Mommsen's introductory note: I have deemed it in general sufficient to give the value of the Roman money approximately in round numbers, assuming for that purpose 100 sesterces as equal to £1 sterling. Tr. Back to the introductory note. Kiepert's map will give a clearer idea of the military consolidation of Italy than can be conveyed by any description.